What is going on, chess YouTube? In today's video, Magnus Carlsen invents a brand new chess opening against his longtime rival Hikaru Nakamura in the Title Tuesday tournament on October 11, 2022. And here we go. In the game, Hikaru Nakamura opens 1a3, expanding on the queen side, as he often does in these Title Tuesday games, especially against Magnus Carlsen. And now here, Magnus on move 1, not to be outdone, he does expand on the king side with the move 1g5, in the spirit of the Grob opening. Now here Hikaru on move 2, he does play e4, a pretty standard move, and now Magnus, he expands on the queen side with the move 2c5 in the spirit of the Sicilian defense. And now here on move 2, this position has never been achieved in the history of chess, making this a brand new chess opening. It's as if white went 1e4, black went 1c5, then white went 2a3, a favor of Gotham chess in the Sicilian defense, and then black went g5. No matter what order you play these moves in, this position is brand new, and I'm calling it the Carlsen Defense. All right, now Hikaru, in this position, he finds the strongest idea for white. That is simply d4, expanding in the center immediately. What's the idea? Well, black can take on d4. That is what's played in the game. It's c takes d4, but now Hikaru, instead of going knight to f3, then knight takes d4, he actually just takes with the queen. Queen takes d4. This is the strongest move. The queen is very strong on d4. The idea being, of course, the queen threatens that rook on h8. Queen takes h8 is a very real threat in this position. And now Magnus, on move 4, how is he going to defend that rook? Well, there are two playable moves here. The first one is f6. That is the Ben Feingold signature move. And the other one is knight to f6. Either way, you have to block that diagonal. Now here, f6 does not work out that well. The idea being you are trying to defend that pawn on g5. However, Hikaru, he would have the resource bishop takes g5 anyway, as that pawn on f6 would be pinned to the rook on h8. If you take the bishop, f takes g5, then queen takes h8 would win the rook on the spot anyway. So f6, although it looks at first glance like it is defending the pawn on g5, it's not really. Therefore, in the game, Magnus, he did play the move knight to f6, blocking this diagonal with the knight. That is by far the best move. Now we can go say bishop g7 and short castles in the future. Now here Hikaru, bishop takes g5 is the move, winning that free pawn. He's a simple man. He sees a free pawn, he wins a free pawn. And now, of course, the threat is bishop takes f6. That is a very big threat. If Hikaru can get that move in, then black's pawn structure on the king side will be irreconcilably damaged. All right, Magnus, he knows that. In the game, he puts immediate pressure on that queen. Knight to c6 is the move. An excellent idea. Of course, with that pawn on d7, there is no bishop b5 resource pinning that knight to the king on e8. Therefore, knight takes d4 is a very real threat, and Hikaru, his only chance to save the queen is to move it. Now here, in this position on move 6, there are many playable squares the queen can go to. For example, queen to e3 is good, queen d3 is fine, queen d1, queen c4, queen to a4. All these moves are perfectly fine. In the game, Hikaru does go queen d3, a good square for the queen, maintaining the defense of that pawn on e4. Therefore, knight takes e4 is not a threat yet. And once again, Hikaru is threatening bishop takes f6. So here, Magnus, he has to respect that threat. What should he be doing here in this position? Well, it turns out the strongest move for Magnus, of course, is going to be queen to a5, putting pressure on that bishop on g5 and the king on e2. Therefore, bishop d2 would be the only good response. Queen to a5, bishop d2, and then you slide the queen back to the b6 square, putting pressure on that vulnerable pawn on b2. That would be the correct sequence. However, instead in the game, Magnus, he just goes queen b6 immediately. Now, what is the drawback of this move instead of queen to a5 first? Well, here, Hikaru, he does not have to respect that threat on b2 immediately. Instead, he has the option of just bishop takes f6, trading off that bishop for the knight, and damaging black's pawn structure on the king side. And again, the intermediate move after bishop takes queen takes b2 is not a possibility, as that bishop on f6 would temporarily defend b2 anyway. Therefore, bishop takes f6 is the strongest idea here, but instead Hikaru in the game, bishop c1 was played, simply defending that pawn on the b2 square. Now here, Magnus, knight to g4 is the move, putting immediate pressure on that pawn on f2. Now knight takes f2 and queen takes f2 are both threatened. Magnus fighting back in this brand new chess opening. All right, here, Hikaru, what should he be doing in this position? Well, he defends that pawn on f2, and there are two main ways to do it. You can go queen to g3, defending the pawn and putting pressure on the knight. You can also go knight to h3 as Hikaru played in the game. This is a perfectly fine move. The knight does a great job of defending f2. All right, from here, Magnus, he's down a pawn, but he still has fighting chances in this opening. All right, what should he be doing from here? Well, the computer finds many playable ideas. For example, knight g to e5 is quite good, centralizing the knight and putting pressure on that queen on d3. Beyond that, you can also go d6 and d5, breaking in the center right away. Now in the game, Magnus did go d6, a very fine move, supporting that knight on e5 in the future and opening up this diagonal for the bishop. If he goes knight g to e5, then bishop takes h3 will be a very real threat. Now Hikaru, knight to c3 is the move, developing the knight on the queen side perfectly fine, and Magnus does go knight g to e5, centralizing that knight, a very common idea in the Najdorf variation of the Sicilian defense, especially the very sharp 6 bishop g5 variation. Now here Hikaru, his queen on d3 of course is being threatened. Where does it want to go? Well, once again, there are many good squares. For example, d1 is good, g3 is good, but in the game, Hikaru, he decided to get those queens off the board ASAP. He simply goes queen to b5, offering that queen trade on the b5 square, and Magnus does oblige. Magnus being the greatest endgame player of all time, he simply takes on b5, queen takes, then bishop takes, and Magnus is just oh too happy to play an endgame against Hikaru in this brand new chess opening. All right, now Magnus, he spots the strongest idea. That knight on h3 is vulnerable, so of course with that in mind, bishop takes h3 is the move, capturing that knight with the bishop, and in the process, damaging white's pawn structure on the king side after g takes h3. Now here, Magnus, despite being down a pawn, those pawns on the h-file are quite weak, and Magnus Carlsen is doing relatively okay. As you can see by the eval bar on the left, the computer says Hikaru's up by roughly 0.5 pawns, meaning he has a small advantage, but it's nothing too crazy despite Magnus Carlsen's crazy new opening idea in this game. Now here, a6 is the move, driving back that bishop on b5. Where does it want to go? Well, the computer finds many different ideas. You can take on c6 immediately. Bishop takes, then b takes is quite okay for white. Beyond that, you can also play the very cheeky idea, knight d5, jumping in with the knight immediately. The idea being if a takes b5, then you jump in with the knight to c7, forking both the king on e8 and the rook on the a8 square. Now, instead of those ideas in the game, Hikaru did go bishop e2, a perfectly fine move, just retreating the bishop. But the drawback of this move is white's c2 square is now quite vulnerable, and now Magnus, he jumps in with the knight to d4, a very strong move, putting pressure on that bishop on e2 and that pawn on c2. Now, Hikaru, how does he want to defend? In the game, he does go king d1, a perfectly fine idea, defending both the pawn on c2 and maintaining the defense of that bishop on e2 with the king. However, the drawback of this is now Magnus can eliminate the bishop pair of Hikaru. Right now, Hikaru, he has those 2 bishops, whereas Magnus only has 1. That is a very large advantage. Modern computers show in an open position, those 2 bishops are worth roughly half a pawn, and here Magnus, he simply jumps in on e2, knight takes e2, capturing one of those 2 b's, and now after the move, knight takes e2, of course, neither side has the bishop pair. That is a very big achievement for Magnus, and as you can see by the eval bar on the left, now the computer says the game is roughly equal, meaning Magnus Carlsen has successfully equalized following his crazy new opening I'm calling the Carlsen Defense. Now here, rook to c8 on the board for Magnus, a fine move. However, I do want to point out, the computer liked the idea of rook to g8 first a little bit better. The idea being right now in this position on move 16, Hikaru has the option of going rook g1, challenging that open g-file, and stopping rook g8 from Magnus. However, instead in the game, b3 was the move, the idea being stopping future knight to c4 ideas. That b-pawn does control the c4 square, but now Magnus, rook g8, taking control of that open g-file, Magnus slowly but surely taking over in this endgame. All right, now Hikaru, what should he be doing from here? Well, b3 does allow the idea of bishop b2, but it turns out that is not the right idea in this position. That bishop would be too far away from the defense of the king side. For example, if Hikaru went bishop b2, then the response from Magnus would be rook to g2, putting pressure on that pawn on f2 and h2. Now, instead of allowing that, Hikaru, he simply goes bishop to e3, a much stronger move. Now the idea being, if rook g2, that pawn on f2 is defended by the bishop, that being one of the advantages of having that bishop on the center square instead of on b2 with the fianchetto. Now here, Magnus, in this position, what should he be doing here? Well, it turns out the best idea is to slow play the position. You don't want to do anything too fast. For example, King d7 is fine. e6 is fine. Rook g6 is fine as well. However, instead in the game, Magnus, he plays a more committal idea on the king side, b5 immediately. Now, of course, Magnus is in time pressure. As you can see, Magnus only has 29 seconds left on the clock versus the 55 of Hikaru. That means this move may have been played in a little bit of time pressure, but it turns out b5, expanding on the queen side, despite being a thematic idea in the Sicilian defense, it is a little bit premature here. Now, Hikaru, a4, expanding on the queen side, threatening a takes b5. If he gets that move in, that pawn on b5 will be very, very weak. Therefore, Magnus, of course, he does go b4, defending that pawn. But now Hikaru plays a very interesting idea, a5, further expanding on the queen side and locking down those pawns. Those pawns are now disconnected. They are unable to defend each other on a6 and on b5. And beyond that, White has the idea of rook to a4, putting pressure on that pawn on b4 in the future. So, a5, a very strong idea by Hikaru. Now here, Magnus, e6 is the move, a solid choice, intending perhaps bishop to e7 in the future, and beyond that, controlling those squares on d5 and f5. So a good multi-purpose move. Now Hikaru, rook to a2, preemptively defending the pawn on c2. Interesting idea. And now bishop e7 for Magnus, standard development. Now Hikaru, knight to g3, just developing that knight and defending e4 preemptively. And now king d7 for Magnus. Again, very standard stuff. Now king to e2 for Hikaru, this being the idea of rook to a2. He wanted his king on e2, and therefore he does defend the pawn preemptively with that rook, therefore allowing king to e2 without allowing rook takes c2 from black. Now here, Magnus, bishop d8, putting pressure on that pawn on a5, a solid idea. d8 is definitely a more active square than e7 for the bishop, but now rook d1 for Hikaru, lining up the rook with the queen, the king, and that pawn on d6, and now bishop c5 could be a real threat in the future, as that pawn on d6 would be pinned to the king on d7. Now here, Magnus, rook to b8, defends the pawn on b4 preemptively. Magnus sort of making a waiting move, basically passing the ball into Hikaru's court. However, it turns out this move is very, very slow, and here Hikaru finds a good way to increase the pressure immediately on the king side. That's right, he does expand on the king side with the move f4, gaining space and knocking back that knight on the e5 square. So excellent move by Hikaru. And now, where is the knight going to go? Well, you have two main squares here for the knight. Knight to c6 and knight g6. It turns out knight g6 would be a much weaker idea. The knight is blocked off on the king side. It blocks the rook on g8. Overall, it's not doing very much. And after, say, rook to a4 from Hikaru, the rook would be very active. Magnus would be in a lot of trouble. Therefore, instead in the game, knight to c6 was played by Magnus. But now Hikaru, he shows one of his big ideas in this position. With that rook no longer on the c-file, here, as discussed earlier, bishop c5 is a very real threat, and that is what Hikaru does here. So, bishop c5 on the board, threatening bishop takes d6 or rook takes, and putting some pressure on that pawn on b4 if I can draw arrows correctly. Now here, Magnus, bishop c7 does defend, but now Hikaru, he plays bishop takes d6 anyway. What is the idea? Of course, if you take with the bishop that was played by Magnus in the game, bishop takes d6, then of course the move for Hikaru is going to be e5, expanding in the center and putting pressure on that pin piece, that being the bishop on d6. Now bishop takes e5, or even retreating, bishop e7 or bishop c7. Those are not possibilities, as that bishop is pinned to the king. Now here, Magnus, king c7, stepping out of the pin, but Hikaru just takes on d6. E takes d6, wins back that piece, and now he has a very strong pass pawn on d6. That is a huge asset in this position. All right, now the king is under attack. Where should the king go? Obviously, the king must move. There is no way to capture that pawn on d6. Well, the two best squares are d7 and d8. It turns out d8 is much safer. You are further away from the action with the king, but instead in the game, Magnus, he does play king d7, trying to blockade that pawn on d6, but it turns out this was quite a bit weaker. And here Hikaru, he shows the problem with this move. Knight to e4, jumping in with the knight and threatening both knight c5 and knight to f6. Both of those moves would fork something. For example, knight f6 forks both the rook and the king, and knight c5 forks the king and that pawn on a6. If that pawn on a6 falls, then a5 will be a pass pawn, and that will be a huge asset in the game for Hikaru. So now, Magnus, how does he defend? Well, the best defense here, believe it or not, is just king d8, once again stepping back with the king, stepping out of these threats. However, instead in the game, Magnus, he does go rook g2, opting for a more active choice in time pressure. Of course, Magnus down to 8 seconds left here versus the 38 seconds of Hikaru. Magnus in extreme time pressure, but rook g2 turns out is a very weak move here. Here Hikaru, king to f3, stepping out of the check and attacking the rook on g2. Now the rook must move once again. Rook takes h2 played in the game, but now Hikaru, knight c5, again jumping in with that knight, forking both that king on d7 and that pawn on a6, meaning that pawn is going to fall. All right, king to e8 played in the game, and now instead of knight takes a6, that was perhaps the move Magnus was expecting, but of course, Magnus, he has just 3 seconds left on the clock. Therefore, with that in mind, Hikaru, he doesn't play the obvious move. Instead, the move played in the game was rook to g1, threatening rook g8, skewering the king and the rook on the b8 square. And of course, he maintains the idea of knight takes a5. And here, Magnus, being very, very surprised by this move, he simply runs out of time. He only had 3 seconds left on the clock. The clock runs out. Therefore, here, Magnus, in a much worse position, he loses on time to Hikaru Nakamura in this brand new chess opening. Again, I'm calling the Carlsen Defense. Wow, what a game. All right, Chess YouTube, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, smash that like button and check out this video right here, where once again, Magnus Carlsen invents another brand new chess opening against Hikaru Nakamura in Title Tuesday. These guys just do it all the time. And if you enjoyed this video, I'm sure you'll love that one, so check it out, and I will see you in the next video.